Hello and welcome everyone to a new episode from the Menopause Symposium, where we bring you new and up-to-date information from the world of menopause. Today we have a rather brief episode, and thought we could speak about the placebo effect in menopause treatments. And I'm sure you all came across this concept, and often it gets debated in research circle. But a critical question is how can we estimate it, and how it could obviously affect clinical practice. So came across this very interesting meta-analysis from Tianyu Zhou, which was published in the Journal of Menopause last year. And the author aimed to sort of meta-analyze or pool data across different placebo arms in randomized trials that evaluated different menopausal treatments to detect the placebo effect. Now, the placebo effect is, in very simple terms, when a patient or participant's belief or expectations that they're actually receiving an active treatment leads to an improvement in some of their health outcomes, and most notably those that are subjective. Now, clearly in menopause management, the most commonly reported outcomes are subjective, such as vasomotor symptoms frequency and severity, as well as poor sleep quality or sex drive or other subjectively assessed outcomes, which makes the process of evaluating treatments aimed at improving these outcomes a little bit more challenging. Now, in research, this can be significantly influenced by the type of study that we are designing. So a very simple example, if you are doing a blinded versus an unblinded study, there is a high potential for a placebo effect to emerge, which can significantly affect the results of the study. So how can we address this, and how would this impact clinical practice? Because is it ethical to give a placebo treatment to a patient and see if they would perceive any benefits, even without informing them? And will that actually lead to long-term improvement? So these are all valid questions. And we know from previous research that there has been a detectable placebo effect when evaluating the vasomotor symptoms frequency and severity, and this could be up to an improvement of 60%. So this meta-analysis is indeed addressing a very interesting idea. So the author did a search or using PubMed only, and came up with 16 articles reporting on 17 different trials. You can see the search terminologies that they used here, which I'm not very convinced that they would have give them a very comprehensive sort of catch of all relevant trials in this field. The criteria they used is primarily to include placebo-controlled RCTs, those that are enrolling women with moderate or severe VMS in the menopause, and they specify that the VMS should be at 7 to 8 times per day or 50 times per week, so relatively significant VMS, and that the assessment of the treatment should happen at least after 12 weeks. Which is, I think, the minimum sort of follow-up duration you'd expect in menopause trials. Clearly, they excluded reviews, editorials, letters, and other non-primary research articles, and they extracted data on the sample size, the nature of the treatment, and the nature of the assessment, and obviously on the outcomes of interest. Now, they mentioned that when obviously the severity and frequency sometimes could be reported as continuous outcomes or as proportions. And these commonly, when they are continuous, should be reported as standard deviation. But not infrequently, when we are attempting a meta-analysis of continuous outcomes, we'll notice that the authors have reported with standard error or 95% confidence intervals. So a good practice in this case is to convert them statistically to come up with a mean and standard deviation, even if the data is not fully parametric. But the author did not specifically mention that they did that. And the primary outcomes they look into was indeed the severity and the frequency of VMS at 12 weeks. And when a study reported on the frequency as an overall measure per week, the author seems to have estimated it to be done per day. I'm assuming they subtracted it or divided it on by 7, which is not a very accurate way to meta-analyze these studies. But let's see what results they came up with. And clearly they used a random effect model to pool data across these trials. They assessed the risk or the heterogeneity across these trials using I-squared statistics and Cochrane Q statistics, which is a fairly standard practice. And they also attempted to look into the difference in estimated placebo effect across different subgroups. So that is for trials that used HRT treatment versus those that did not, trials that did an oral versus topical treatment, and trials that had an even or uneven allocation treatment, meaning all patients received the same dose or the dose was varied depending to patient's response or clinical need. And they assess the publication bias using Igor's test. Ideally, should be an Igor's test with a funnel plot, but the funnel plot was not available in this case. So let's dig into the results. And basically, they pooled 17 trials of 2,636 participants. So it's quite a decent sample size. And not unsurprisingly, most of the studies were from United States and Europe. And this is a common problem with randomized trials in menopause, is that they're concentrated in these very um, um, specific sort of population, and the generalizability is therefore somewhat limited. And the sample size ranged from 53 to 317. So some of these trials were had fairly good sample sizes. Now, they pooled 70 trials into the frequency meta-analysis and 13 trials into the severity meta-analysis. So there is some mismatch in reporting across these trials. And very interestingly, when looking at the reduction in the frequency of moderate or severe VMS, the author did find a significant reduction per day, averaging to around 5, which is fairly robust trial. And if you look on the forest plots to the left, you'll see that there is a fairly consistent placebo effect in the placebo arm that is not really varied. And even in smaller trials, the confidence intervals are not particularly wide. So that gives more reassurance that this placebo effect is actually consistent across all these trials. And if when they estimated the proportion of VMS frequency reduction by 12 weeks, this ranged from 30 to 66%. So that is quite substantive in that technically we could observe up to 66% reduction in VMS frequency simply due to a placebo. And clearly we have to interpret this, how would that happen in clinical practice, and how the different treatments we use or combine might carry with them a unseen or unassessed a placebo effect. And when they looked into the severity, there was a similar trend, although the results here are a little bit more varied, as like there's varied distribution with some bigger trials. You can see the 2019 Brickhauser trial, that where the effect is a bit closer to the null line, versus others that are, where a wider effect estimate was seen, such as that one in Gaspard in 2020, with a bit wider confidence intervals. And still, the overall assessment is there was a reduction in mean change by minus 0.36, and the observed mean change at week 9 from baseline ranged between 0.08 and 0.66. So it is still quite significant. Now, the author did look into the potential risk of publication bias and didn't find significant one for the meta-analysis of VMS frequency. However, there was some evidence of publication bias in the meta-analysis for VMS severity, which is consistent with the variation in the forest plots that we saw. And when they did the subgroup analyses per the categories that we discussed, so hormonal treatment versus non-hormonal treatment, allocation in terms of even or uneven treatment to participants, and the use of oral or topical treatment, there was actually no significant variations between these subgroups. Which is somewhat reassuring in the confidence of these results. Now, clearly, while this is a very useful meta-analysis because it's telling us that as menopause specialists, we should not be underestimating the potential for placebo effect in the treatments we're providing, and maybe we should use it to our advantage, but most importantly, we should be informing the patient that this might be the case, and that the treatment, the response to the treatment might change with time. But this meta-analysis suffered from several limitations, although it's great effort and fantastic idea to come up with such analysis. But the most common, the most clear ones is the fact that it was limited to a PubMed search, and the author did not look through other relevant databases such as Embase or Cochrane. It was a single author effort, which is a lot of work to produce such analysis and publish it, but usually in a systematic approach, there is need for a duplicate independent reviewer's assessment for data extraction and a risk of bias assessment. Clearly, the author did not report on any risk of bias, which specifically limits the ability to adjust for the risk of bias across these trials, specifically if there is a Hawthorne effect, for example. And another hidden flaw is that the comparison across these arms is from placebo to a different treatment in the other arm, and therefore the population across these trials and the perceived treatment might not be the same, and so there is a methodological flaw in pooling data in this manner. And there is they also did not adjust for other potential confounders, even if they did that. These subgroups, so for example, the age of the participants, the latency from starting or stopping the treatment, how if all the participants all treatment naive or they tried different treatment before joining the trial. All these are important confounders when conducting a meta-analysis in the world of menopause, and we recently published an article highlighting the importance of progressing in our analyses and when assessing different trials in the world of menopause and menopausal treatments. So a very helpful article indeed, and clearly the conclusion is that we have to be mindful of the placebo effect that can transpire when dealing with menopausal treatments, specifically that could be impacting vasomotor symptoms frequency and severity, as well as other outcomes. I'm sure that in this particular meta-analysis, there was no reporting on other important outcomes like sex drive, for example, that could be significantly impacted by several factors, and it's quite a multifactorial sort of health outcome. But the key message is that this placebo effect is there, and we can only sort of adjust for it through proper, robust trial design for future studies, and we should be mindful of it in clinical practice. So I hope this is a enjoyable sort of rapid menopause symposium. I will be back with Vikram next month with more interesting articles. And until then, we're looking forward to continue to receive your comments and feedback and likes on social media platforms. Thank you very much.